You're listening to the Quint podcast.
Agriculture has historically been one of the major contributors to the Indian economy, while employing over half of the country's population. Recent studies estimate that about 58% of India's population is dependent on agriculture as a primary source of livelihood. In spite of this, a significant population of farmers and farm workers are among the most vulnerable economic groups in the country. Historically, the government has relied overwhelmingly on subsidy-based schemes and erratic loan waivers to provide farmers social security. However, since 2013, there's been an increase in the idea and practice of directly transferring money to the beneficiaries, a model which is commonly referred to as DBT or direct benefit transfers. DBT schemes targeting farmers, such as the PM KISAN scheme, have also been a popular channel for supporting farmers with direct income during the COVID-19 crisis. The Telangana government's Raitu Bandhu scheme, or RBS, is one early example where the government transfers Rs 10,000 per acre to every person owning agricultural land. The two guests who will be joining me today have spent 6 months conducting fieldwork in Telangana, where they assessed the effectiveness of the scheme on the ground. This is the Quint's fortnightly podcast, Land of a Billion. Welcome. This podcast is produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium, or PRRC, which is supported by Omidyar Network India, an investment firm focused on social impact. PRRC is a network of leading think tanks and research organizations working to collaborate and drive policy action in the field of land, housing, and property rights in India. We have with us today Diya Uday and Bhargavi Zaveri, researchers with the Finance Research Group. In the field of land and access to finance, Diya and Bhargavi have worked on several projects, including field-level assessments of the Digital Land Rights Modernization Program in Maharashtra and the Raitu Bandhu scheme. And the RBS is what we'll be focusing on today. Welcome, Bhargavi and Diya. It's great to have you both on the show.
Thank you, Abhishek, for having us here. It's a pleasure to be here and to also share some of the work we're doing in the area of land and land rights.
Thanks, Abhishek. It's great to be here.
So, the goal of our podcast is to understand what it takes to secure land rights for a billion. Based on your research experience and given the focus on farmer support in this episode, could you tell us about why secure land rights are so important for farmers?
So for anyone to understand why secure land rights are important for farmers, it is also important to understand what secure land rights mean and the implications of the insecurity in land rights. So to break it down, there are 3 kinds of security of rights or tenure in land, and the technical term for the first is de jure security, which is the security that the law provides. So what this means is that this is the legal title that is conferred on you for any interest that you may hold in the land, for example, ownership. Now, as a consequence of this legal title, you will be protected, say, against unlawful eviction, or you can enforce your rights in a court, you can transfer your rights in the land by selling the land to another, and so on and so forth. And all of these implications of de jure tenure security are important to all landholders, including farmers, to effectively exercise their right in a meaningful way or to capitalize on the value of your land. Now, there are some unique features in the framework that sometimes render these rights ineffective, especially for farmers. So, for instance, today, even if you have de jure land title, there may be many aspects in the framework that actually curtail your power to exercise your rights in respect of the land. So, for example, there are restrictions on the transfer of land by sale, there are restrictions on leasing, and so on. And, anecdotes from our fieldwork have also indicated that farmers, despite having legal ownership, are still afraid to lease out their land because they are unsure if they can actually effectively enforce their right and get back the land if push comes to shove. So, in a technical sense, you may have your legal rights and security, but it may not translate to much on ground. Now, the other 2 concepts of rights are a little more abstract, and they refer to the actual situation on ground and what you perceive your security to be. And what this essentially means is how secure you feel in your rights, regardless of whether or not you have legal title. So you may have legal title, but how confident do you feel in your rights? Now, Some studies have indicated that how you feel about your rights may actually affect the way in which you choose to exercise them and make economic decisions. So, for instance, if a farmer perceives his rights to be more secure, he might say, for example, invest more in the land, as opposed to a farmer who does not perceive his rights to be secure. So, each of these types of security and rights have implications for farmer behavior and on economic outcomes, which determine why they are important for farmers and why they're important. It's important that they are secured.
Mm-hmm. And how has India fared so far in achieving the goal of ensuring secure land rights?
I just wanted to first introduce the big land reforms that India has already done to help people achieve tenure security. So if you see post independence, India has had 4 waves of land reforms until the 70s or 80s, right? The first wave of land reforms involved abolition of zamindari and redistribution of land to the tiller of the land. The second wave of land reforms involved imposing land ceilings and preventing concentration of land in the hands of a few, where most states actually impose agricultural land ceilings, urban land ceilings, so that no single household could actually hold land exceeding a certain size. The third wave of land reforms involved preventing exploitation and forced dispossession. So, for example, people were restricted from transferring their land, leasing out their land, especially agricultural land. And the law defined who you could sell your land to, who you could lease it out to, who you could mortgage it to, etc. And until the 70s, the last wave of land reforms then focused on improving agricultural productivity, which is that agricultural land couldn't be fragmented below a certain size because policymakers believed that agricultural land of less than a certain size actually hindered agricultural productivity. So this is what Indian land reforms focused on until about the 70s. In 80s and 90s, a new school of thought emerged globally, which was Hernando de Soto's school of thought. Hernando de Soto is a Peruvian economist, and he believed that the difference between the developed markets and the underdeveloped markets was not that people didn't own land in underdeveloped markets. So, in fact, if you see, in underdeveloped markets, an excessive proportion of household portfolio actually has land. In India, about 70% of the average household's portfolio is land and real estate. So the difference, Hernando de Soto argued, was that property rights were better recorded in developed economies, which allowed people to exploit their property for the purposes that they urgently needed to, allowed them to get easy access to credit, allowed them to sell it without transaction costs, etc. Now, this was going on in the 90s and early 2000, and De Soto's classic treatise, I think, was written in about 2002. At the same time, Government of India was undertaking its own disinvestment process, and a couple of famous hotels, your listeners would know Ashoka Hotel in Delhi, they couldn't just disinvest from that property simply because the government did not have its own title records. And at that point in time, that drove home the point that actually India needs to strengthen its land records infrastructure to be able to give better tenure security to its people. And since then, land reforms, so to speak, in India have concentrated excessively on land records infrastructure, recording land rights, and the whole push towards conclusive titling. So, for example, some states such as Rajasthan have already passed a conclusive titling law where the state gives you conclusive title. And there has been a conscious push towards, let's move away from presumptive title to conclusive title, and, where the state sets up adjudication mechanisms and conclusive title certificates are issued. And people believe that that will give better tenure security to everybody.
And a small digression just to understand this. Presumptive land titles are not certified by the state machinery. Conclusive titles, on the other hand, are guaranteed by the state and are said to come with a sense of certainty to owners.
It's unclear if this is true, because if you actually see, a survey that was conducted in 2017, it's called the Prindex survey, which measured perceptions of tenure security, found that in India, 75% of the people are actually fairly secure in their tenure. They are fairly confident that they will not be evicted from their property against their will in the next 5 years. And at the same time, the degree of informal holding is also pretty strong in India. So then this creates a paradox, which is that people don't have formal documentation, but are still reasonably confident. At least a small sample size survey shows that people are reasonably confident that they will not be evicted against their will. And therefore, the question that you posed to begin with, which is that how well has India fared on achieving the goal of tenure security, I would say that there is no one goal of tenure security because it means different things to different people. States have progressed differently, have taken different approaches. Rajasthan has taken the conclusive titling approach. Telangana has taken a different approach of just excessively pushing towards digitization of land records. And therefore, each state actually would have progressed differently towards this, a very elusive goal of tenure security. That's a sort of a heterogeneous move towards tenure security, and it's not like the nation has taken one big step or not taken one big step towards tenure security.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us in brief about the history of DBT schemes, especially where land records have been used for beneficiary identification, and what the varied impact these schemes have had so far?
If you look at DBT, and like you mentioned, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And we saw direct benefit transfers being used as a mode of welfare distribution only since 2014. Before that, our primary mode of welfare distribution was subsidies, which is that I will subsidize the cost of a certain input for you, right? Direct benefit transfers is that you will get the cash directly into your bank account. Now, this whole DBT infrastructure requires two elements. Number one, it assumes that you have a bank account. And number two, it links certain identification criteria to your bank account. A small subset of this DBT scheme is DBT schemes linked to land records. And really, we've seen there's no, long-standing history of these kind of schemes because actually the very first scheme which linked DBT to land records was in 2018 by the government of Telangana. That was the first announcement. And since then, we've seen a proliferation of such schemes. In 2019, we had such a scheme being announced by the central government called the PM KISAN, which said that every land-owning farmer will be entitled to a certain amount of about 6,000 rupees annually. Now, since then, 4 other states have launched such schemes. So you have Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, Odisha. They have all launched such DBT schemes linking land records to farm income support. What is the impact of these schemes? Again, I'm afraid I'll have to say we don't know enough. So since this is a relatively recent phenomenon, we haven't studied whether the impact varies from state to state depending on, for example, how simple the scheme is or how complex it is. Or, for example, does the effectiveness of the scheme depend on the effectiveness of the land records infrastructure? Our research indicates that it does. But it will really take a cross-state survey to be able to tell what is the real impact of these schemes. I want to point your listeners to a very recent paper published by IFPRI, which has actually done a survey in UP, where they surveyed about 1,400 farmers who have been beneficiaries of the PM KISAN scheme. And they found that actually the scheme benefited the poorest farmers who were more dependent on agriculture because they actually use this income to invest in their farming operations. Is it enough? Does it tell us conclusively about the impact of these schemes? I would say not, but it's a start.
Right. And in your research for the PRRC, you specifically looked at the Raitu Bandhu scheme that I mentioned in the introduction, which is a state-sponsored income support scheme for land-owning farmers in Telangana. So what features of the scheme ensured that it reasonably achieved its stated objectives and left beneficiaries highly satisfied based on your evaluation?
Sure. So the RBS or the Raitu Bandhu scheme, as you mentioned, is a direct benefit transfer scheme. It involves a biannual payment of money to a landowning farmer in the state before each cropping season. So the idea of the scheme was to enhance the seasonal income of farmers to aid in their agricultural investment. And the aim of the study that Bhargavi and I conducted was to essentially gain insights on, what it takes to implement such a scheme, what are the lessons which might be useful for the other states who are looking to carry out similar schemes, and also to understand what the efficiency of the scheme is. And our study involved a field component where we involved and interviewed members of the administration as well as farmers. Now, in our field interviews with farmers, they reported being satisfied with the scheme. In fact, we learned that farmers had received at least one installment of the amount under the scheme. And the deeper we delved into it, I think the more it became apparent to us that perhaps there were certain features, in the design of the scheme itself that had contributed to its successful implementation. So, for instance, firstly, the scheme is extremely simple to administer in terms of identification of beneficiaries. Okay, the RBS has minimum exclusions in that it includes all landowning farmers regardless of the size of the land they own. So compiling a database of beneficiaries is relatively easy when compared with schemes with more complex designs and more exclusions, such as, say, for example, the PM KISAN scheme. The scheme also did not have any ceiling limits on the extent of the benefit that the beneficiaries are entitled to, which further simplified administration and possibly led to fewer mistakes being made or errors in targeting, in identifying the beneficiaries. So, having a simply designed scheme just lowers the chances of any administrative errors and also reduces the time and cost of the administration of the scheme. A second feature of the scheme design itself is that it limits the touch points between the administration and the farmers, in that the farmers do not have to register for the scheme. So once you're a landowning farmer and you have been issued the relevant land record, you are automatically included within the scope of the scheme. So once your name is updated in the land record as a patadar, which is the owner, you are entitled to a benefit within a specific time. So this reduces an added leg of any sort of verification that an administration official needs to do once you register yourself. And it also reduces perhaps the potential for any kind of, corruption in doing this process as well. Another part of the scheme was that, beneficiaries are not required to show any proof of the fact that they are actually cultivating the land. So if they are a landowner of agricultural land, they are entitled to the scheme benefits. You don't have to show that you are actually cultivating the land. You don't even have to show that you've actually utilized this amount for purchasing agricultural inputs, even though the aim of the scheme was to essentially enhance your income to, enable you to purchase agricultural inputs. So again, significant administrative capacity to do any sort of verification is reduced. I think thirdly, also the scheme relies on a single existing database, which is the land records database in the state, which was anyway improved prior to the implementation of the scheme. And because of its simple eligibility criteria, it didn't really require any matching of information across any databases, and therefore any, problems of mismatches in the data and conflicts in information was avoided. So, for example, unlike some other schemes, it gives benefits at the level of the individual or farmer and not at the level of, say, a farmer family, such as a PM KISAN. This makes identification easier because land records are conducive to identify individuals and not families. So, in order to identify a family, you would have to refer to multiple databases. Again, and reconciling information across these and ensuring that no one is included or excluded to lead to any targeting errors is also quite a mammoth task. So these were some of the scheme features by way of design itself that, possibly helped it succeed.
Mm-hmm. Could you walk me through the groundwork that enabled the RBS?
Okay, so, as we mentioned that the RBS was intended to cover all landowning farmers in the state, okay? And any scheme that is so wide in its coverage obviously requires a fair amount of groundwork before its implementation to ensure success. Now, given the crucial role and the importance of land records for the success of the scheme, the state government did give considerable focus to improving land records in the state, specifically prior to implementation of the scheme. Now, having said that, the then existing state of land records in, Telangana itself was perhaps better already than in most states. Because, for example, in our analysis of the state budget in terms of the allocation and spending by the state, it revealed that, there was consistent allocation of budget as well as spending towards undertaking land reforms. And there were some pilot programs to improve titles which were already being done, we know, at least from 2016. And, Telangana had also made pretty good progress on paper on the digitization of land records under the DILRMP.
That's the Digital India Land Records Modernization Program.
However, it was still perceived by the administration that there were still some areas which were identified as problematic. So, for example, there were still errors in the names on records. In certain records, survey numbers of the land parcels had errors in them and so on. And therefore, they decided to undertake a massive statewide land records updation program called the LRUP to verify these land records. Now, the output of this program would be twofold. On one hand, it would yield better land records. Now, it was decided that certain records, electronic records called patadar passbooks, would be given to the owners of agricultural land. These records had, cool features such as a QR code. It had an Aadhaar linkage, as well as some anti-copying features which make them untamperable. And they also record information such as the name of the owner, the extent of the land, and so on. The second output from this program was to be a land records information system with good access across all governmental departments as well as to the public. Now, to accommodate this program and also the new form of records, they had to make certain amendments in the law as well. And so, for example, they had to introduce provisions in the law to recognize these electronic records and to allow for the electronic updation of these records. They had to make amendments to also simplify the format of these Patadar passbooks. And this was an important feature of the program because what it did was it dispensed away with the requirements to record any other interests other than ownership in the land. So interests such as occupations, mortgages, etc., which may be inherently more difficult to record as classes of rights, were done away with. Now, having done that, the LRUP itself, like I said, was a massive program. It covered about 32 out of 33 districts, which approximates to about 86% of the area of the state. And it was done in two phases. So in the first phase, they tackled titles with errors in them, but which were not disputed. So, these were uncontested errors. And in the second phase, they wanted to tackle all disputed titles. Now, the program itself began, and ended within 3 months. And during these months, there was a large amount of state capacity utilized in terms of human resources. I think there were approximately 3,500 revenue officers who divided themselves into teams. Each team covered nearly approximately 250 acres of land for verification. And, in terms of the actual verification itself, it involved two legs. One was, of course, the desk verification, where they wanted to ensure that the records on paper were updated with the registers maintained by the revenue department. And in the second leg, which was, more difficult to do, it involved a field visit. And this meant that the teams would go down to the villages, update the village revenue profiles, conduct field inspections, and also then undertake corrections of the record. Now, the interesting thing about this process was that at each phase, there was detailed monitoring and certain systems which were set up to ensure reviews and follow-ups and efficient progress by all of the teams. So, even after field teams conducted these updations, there were verification exercises which were done by senior members of the administration who had to then in turn report to the highest revenue officer in the state. And they also, set up things such as control rooms at the district level to ensure that field teams could get quick solutions for any problems they were having on ground, and to also ensure that any progress reports were sent daily from the district level upwards. Now, in addition to this, they also ensured that they conducted, training exercises which aimed at making all teams aware of the objectives of the exercise, the step-by-step process for collection of information, and any statutory process for correction and modification of records. So there was a simultaneous, effort to ensure that also training was given to all of these teams and capacity was built up in that way. In addition to, of course, the improvements in land records itself, there were also information systems which were, put into place to ease the administration and coordination between departments that would be involved in the implementation. So, for example, there was a central database which was made accessible across departments, and later on it would be accessed by all levels of officers. So, information about beneficiaries would be available to all implementation agencies. And this portal also allows officers of all levels to track the delivery of the RBS to the beneficiaries. And at a higher level, the portal also would allow officers to view aggregate information about the progress of the DBT delivery program, which worked as a feedback loop.
Mm-hmm. And we've already started talking about this, but if you can elaborate on the importance of the inclusion and exclusion errors.
So, Abhishek, just to, take a step back again, the whole idea of the DBT method of transferring welfare benefits to people was that you want to plug leakages. You want to increase the efficiency of the welfare distribution schemes, right? So one leg of our work in Telangana really involved assessing how efficient the Raitu Bandhu scheme was, because it was one of the earliest schemes that linked land records to welfare distribution. The way we proceeded to do this work was as follows. We identified 2 villages in 2 different districts in Telangana. The districts that we selected for our study were Nalgonda, which is one of the classic standard, one of the 33 districts that Telangana has. And the other district was Mulugu, which is a backward district, has a lot of forest area, has a lot of scheduled tribes and scheduled zones, right? And we actually went down to the villages and compared the village level land records to the Raitu Bandhu beneficiary lists. The hypothesis was as follows, that if your name appears in the land record and in the Raitu Bandhu beneficiary list, it's a perfect implementation of the scheme. If your name appears in the land record but does not appear in the beneficiary list, it's an exclusion error. You have been unfairly excluded. And if your name appears in the Raitu Bandhu beneficiary list but not in the land record, then you have been wrongly included, right? When we ran these matches between the village level land records, and these were physical records in Telugu, with the Raitu Bandhu records, what we found was actually pretty counterintuitive. In one of our villages, we saw a 22% exclusion error, which means that 22% of the people who were there on the land records wouldn't feature in the beneficiary list at all. And this was in one of the better situated villages in Nalgonda, which is closer to the district collector's office. And in the other village, what we found, it was a scheduled area far away from the district collector's office, what we found is that there was zero exclusion error, which means that every person whose name appeared on the land record actually appeared as a beneficiary of the Raitu Bandhu. But we found an inclusion error, which means that about 11% of the people in this village who appeared in the Raitu Bandhu records, actually their names didn't come up in the land records at all. In absolute terms, perhaps this is a lower error rate, so to speak, 22% and 11% respectively. But yes, it was counterintuitive because one would believe that in villages which are in scheduled areas, you're likely to see a higher exclusion rate than in villages which are, relatively better situated, closer to a district administration, etc. The other key finding from this, matching exercise was as follows. What we found is that there was a high level of discrepancy in the area that was recorded in the Raitu Bandhu list. So what I mean is that Raitu Bandhu basically gives 5,000 rupees per acre to every land-owning farmer. So the amount of land that you hold and appears in the records is therefore very important because it determines the extent of your entitlement. The average discrepancy between the land record and the Raitu Bandhu beneficiary list was somewhere in the zone of 0.55 acres. Now, what is the importance of this? What we find is that because of this area discrepancy, obviously there is an excess payout that the government is making in these 2 villages at least. And we aggregated the area discrepancy between Raitu Bandhu and land records, and we found that about 400 acres of extra area was being included in the Raitu Bandhu beneficiary list. And we estimate the annual excess payout because of this discrepancy to be in the range of about 46 lakh for both these villages. Now, this is about 26% of the total payout that the government is making for these 2 villages under the Raitu Bandhu scheme, therefore seems to be due to an area discrepancy between land records and Raitu Bandhu beneficiary lists. Now, there are 2 reasons why this is important. One is, of course, this is important because the government is making an excess payout, and it's leaning towards over-inclusion, which means that people are getting more than the land that they actually own as per the land record. And second is that it actually shows you what the weakest link in the land records infrastructure is. So, like I mentioned, there was, in absolute terms, in terms of number of people excluded or included, it's not much. But the greater discrepancy is in the area, which means that the part of the land record which records the area seems to be the weakest link. And that links to the way, the land records exercise was conducted before Raitu Bandhu was rolled out. All that was verified was, are you an owner of the land parcel or are you not? The land records reflects that you own 5 acres. Is it true that you own 5 acres or not? Now, there was no actual field survey done to be able to verify whether you really own 5 acres on the ground as reflected in the record or otherwise. So these are the 2 big implications of our village level matching exercise.
Right. And could you share a few key lessons for states attempting to implement similar income support schemes and also for the centrally supported PM KISAN scheme?
Sure. So, lesson number one would be design a scheme which is easy to administer. Okay, so the RBS is relatively simpler to administer, as I've mentioned before, because it is unconditional and relies on pre-existing land records infrastructure. Now, in designing a scheme, a state should take into account the costs and benefits of creating extensive exclusions or eligibility criteria. Now, for example, a DBT scheme like the RBS may appear inequitable on the face of it because the amount of entitlement received increases in proportion to the size of the land parcel you own. But if you were to look at this in the context of the land holding patterns in the state, you would see that about 85% of the agricultural land parcels in Telangana fall in the small and marginal category, and only about 3% are in the medium to large category. So while it may seem attractive to impose, say thresholds, ceilings, and exclusions on the amount that can be given to large farmers, the cost is that it might create an administrative burden, which in turn may cause targeting errors, which may lead to, certain other unintended consequences, such as the fragmentation of land by big landholders to fit within the ambit of the scheme. So whenever designing, a scheme, one should take into account the costs and benefits of every provision of that scheme. Lesson number two would be that, a scheme is only as good as the data it relies on. So identifying the most appropriate database to rely on for the implementation of the scheme and ensuring that database is clean and contains updated data, I think is essential. Again, in the world of DBTs, there are two sides of arguments for and against having a top-down approach to identify beneficiaries. Should farmers register themselves or should the state identify beneficiaries? And in our experience, we see that a top-down approach with reduced touch points with the administration by automatically including farmers within the scope of the scheme the minute the database is updated reduces the time and cost of administration. There should also be sufficient amount of flexibility to keep adding beneficiaries under the scheme without imposing cutoff dates, as we have seen in some of the schemes, including the PM KISAN scheme. Lesson number 4 is an important one. I think there must be a grievance redressal system where beneficiaries can seek settlements of their claims. This is one aspect of the RBS which we found was lacking. So states that propose to roll out DBTs must put into place an effective grievance redressal mechanism that will allow you, to monitor claims that are coming in and also allow complaints to be filed with ease. And the added advantage of having a grievance redressal system, other than, of course, it helping citizen services, is also the fact that it acts as a great feedback loop for the administration to identify any sort of, deficiencies that the scheme might actually have. I would also say that there must be systems for, departmental coordination and monitoring that allows officers, not only of the senior level, but of all levels, to track the delivery of the DBT entitlements to beneficiaries. So, as we mentioned before, one of the striking features of the implementation of the RBS was setting up of these systems with central servers that connected the entire department regardless of the hierarchy. So once the land data was provided to the agriculture department, the information was fed into a central portal that was accessible by all officers of the agriculture department, including those who were responsible for the last mile delivery. And this kind of portal then allows officers of all levels to track the delivery. And at the higher level of administration, it also allows you to, view the information in an aggregated way and get a 20-foot view about what your progress of the DBT delivery program is as of now.
Right. And while the state's attempt at identifying beneficiaries through land records seems to have worked for RBS, I'm curious as to why it hasn't been used for other similar schemes before.
Like we discussed, Abhishek, DBT is a relatively recent phenomenon to begin with. I mean, it's been around for not more than 5 years, so to speak. And at the same time, the state of land records varies from state to state, right? So what we've seen is that while some states have made considerable progress in digitizing their land records, making it possible for them to link their land records to schemes such as RBS, some states have not made so much progress. And perhaps that is the reason why, while some states are able to do it, even after having, rolling out a second verification exercise, others are still on the way to do it or are at some stage of digitization, and at some point will perhaps see value in linking land records to DBT schemes.
And given that disputes over land and property form a bulk of civil cases, how was the Telangana government able to clear, as your research finds, about 95% of the agricultural land as being free from ownership related disputes?
Actually, this finding may be counterintuitive, or like you're rightly pointing out, to most of us who believe that land is a heavily disputed subject. But I think what we do not speak about often enough is what aspect of land record is being heavily disputed. Is it the ownership right? Is it the land parcel size? Is it the encumbrance? Is it the possession? So there are so many aspects of land ownership, and what part of it is really most heavily disputed? It's something that needs more research. So the fact that Telangana government could clear about 95% of the land records in its LRUP exercise for the purpose of ownership doesn't come as a surprise to us if we look at a previous study that we did in Maharashtra, where we actually went down to 100 land parcels spread across 2 districts in Maharashtra and verified the digital land record with the ground reality. So we looked at things like, does the person who's reflected as the owner in the land record actually own the land in reality? Is the size of the land parcel that is reflected in the land record actually held by the owner in reality, and so on and so forth? What we found is that actually there is a very high level of match between the owner reflected in the land record and the actual owner in reality. So this was a common finding across 3 states, Maharashtra, Himachal, and Rajasthan, where the study was being done by NCAER and NIPFP. However, a high degree of inconsistency was found in the parcel measurement, in the area of the parcel. So the area of the parcel would typically be less or more than what is actually reflected in the land record. Now, if we go back to what LRUP, the Land Records Updation Drive, did in Telangana, is that it really just verified ownership rights, right? It restricted the matter that was being recorded in the digitized land record to who is the owner and what is the kind of land and what is the area of the parcel. And if you were to just run an exercise which just verifies these limited aspects of land parcels, and it shouldn't surprise us that you have been able to clear such a high degree of land in your state by just verifying ownership rights, because it seems like even in other states there is a high degree of matching between who the owner is reflected in the land record and who the owner is actually on the ground, as counterintuitive as it may seem. On the other hand, if the LRUP were to also get into aspects like, does the size of the land parcel occupied by you actually match with the size of the land parcel reflected in the land record, or what kind of encumbrances such as mortgages or, say, for example, tenancies, if those rights were to be verified, I suspect that it wouldn't have been 95% that would have been cleared in the LRUP. You probably would have found a much higher level of dispute rates.
Right. And a significant criticism against the RBS and other DBT schemes is that they exclude tenant farmers, landless tillers, and community-based farmers as beneficiaries. Is this a valid criticism? And if it is, how could the state ensure that these marginalized groups also gain access to DBT schemes?
Sure. So the idea of the RBS was to give income support to landowners and leave it to the owner to decide whether or not to push down these benefits that he's received under the scheme. The simple answer is yes, tenant farmers and landless tillers should be included within the scope. We did receive accounts of informal borrowings by tenant farmers and also heard that the benefits of the RBS were not necessarily being pushed down to the tenants. But I think it's important to look at this not merely as a scheme design issue or a deficient policy decision, to keep tenant farmers out of the scheme. But it is an unfortunate outcome of perhaps a framework that pertains to agricultural land leasing in India, which is either highly restricted or prohibited entirely. Now, the outcome of these frameworks is a situation where agricultural land leasing today happens on an informal basis with, limited formal agreements. So then identification of these tenants becomes a problem. So in fact, in our fieldwork, we found that many tenant farmers we interviewed did not have official documentation despite land leasing being permitted in Telangana. So, even in states where tenancy is permitted, the land records themselves may not necessarily have provisions to record tenancy rights, again, causing an identification problem. So the main problem is, how do we identify these groups to include them within the schemes? So, long story short, while schemes should be designed to include such groups as well, I think states need to think about what infrastructure will enable them to effectively identify these groups and implement the program effectively among them with, minimum targeting errors and leakages in terms of the finances of the scheme.
So lastly, a question that we'd like to ask all our guests on the show is, what will it take to secure land rights for 1 billion going forward?
So I think the big stumbling block is that there are many misconceived and, short-sighted perceptions surrounding land and agriculture, which tend to influence the policy process and perhaps what even interest groups advocate for. So, we often walk into reforms without regard for the unseen consequences of those reforms. So, for example, we've previously spoken about the restrictions on land transfers by farmers, which may seem, like a good idea in the context of protection of farmers. But in fact, we often fail to examine the flip side of such policies, which is that it might in turn affect a farmer's own ability to capitalize effectively on his land and also, act as a sort of shackle in allowing them to exercise these rights. So I think it will take sound policy decisions which are based on data-backed research, which I think, is not necessarily the case today, which demonstrates key problems. So we need data-backed research on the type of problems, on the extent of the problems. And I do think that this is what will lead us to, the kind of targeted and economically sound reforms that we are in need of today.
Thank you, Diya and Bhargavi, for joining us on Land of 1 Billion and lucidly sharing several nuances related to DBT schemes.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you, Abhishek. This was great.
One among the many takeaways for me from this discussion was learning about how reliable land records can play an important role in determining the success of cash transfer schemes such as RBS or PM KISAN, which are linked to land holdings. Diya and Bhargavi also added that research comparing the performance of schemes across different states is needed to understand the impact of this relatively new form of governmental support. Based on our conversation, it's also clear that there are several ways we can achieve secure land rights for 1 billion, and there's much more to explore. Stay tuned with us by subscribing to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and JioSaavn, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. And of course, we'd love to hear from you about this episode. Do send us your message through Twitter or tweet and tag us, where PRRC_India. And if you like this episode, please consider sharing it. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.